Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. Today we begin the story of how religion has impacted life here on the Gulf Coast at Pensacola, beginning with the middle of the 16th century. And of course, our story must begin with the tale of the 7 Dominican friars who accompanied Don Tristan de Luna in the expedition which began here in August of 1559 and which continued for about 20 months. The friars were unique men. They not only brought spiritual comfort to the colonists, they aided in the relationships with the Native Americans, and when problems such as the Great Storm occurred, they were a tower of strength, helping the people create what we would today call an emergency room for the care of the many, many injured people we have. And of course, all through that story, there were episodes in which the friars stepped forward with spiritual comfort. For 138 years, of course, Pensacola was a void. We had no settlements here. And when the Spanish returned in 1698, they had no clergyman with them. And for the next 20 years, while the Spanish were here, and of course the French nearby at Mobile, there was a rather sketchy story of religion. For most of that 20 years, the spiritual comfort came from chaplains who were more or less loaned here from the French colony at Mobile. Late in the period, beginning in about 1717, a chaplain was here who was Spanish, but we have very little record of who he was and what he did. Then, of course, after a void of about 3 years, the Spanish returned, setting up a little settlement on Santa Rosa Island. And of course, we have that wonderful picture of what the village was like. And right in the right center of that picture is an 8-sided wooden chapel or church which was built for that specific purpose. We know very little about how people worship there, and we have no details at all about clergy, but we must assume that they were there. And of course, this was a settlement which lasted here on that particular location for 30 years. And then, of course, a hurricane destroyed the settlement. The survivors moved across the bay and set up the beginnings of what we call Pensacola today. We know precious little about the spiritual comfort for those roughly 250 Spaniards who were here on the coast at Pensacola from 1752 to 63. Then, of course, came the British, and as we referred to it in the story of the British period, we had the beginnings here with Reverend Nath Cotton, who arrived here in 1767. He and a few additional chaplains arrived to cover the period up to 1781, but the British never built a church here. All of the religious activities, as with the school, were concentrated in what was called Government House. When the Spanish returned, there was a succession of Catholic priests who joined them. They built no church, and people like Father Coleman, who was the most prominent of these priests, literally carried on their religious activities, their church services. The story goes on the second floor of a warehouse, some down along the bay. We have no idea what it looked like, but the story comes to us from Father Coleman's diary. Basically, he said they worshipped in a warehouse, but that's basically all we know. And then the final story we have, of course, about the Spanish period doesn't deal with the Spanish themselves, but rather with Rachel Jackson. Rachel was, of course, a very religious woman, and she accompanied her husband when he came here to oversee the exchange of flags between the United States and Spain. That was delayed somewhat, and so Rachel came into the city and was here for about 2 weeks during that interim period, and she stayed at the home of Dr. John Brosenham. And now Rachel became very upset because on Sunday morning she would stand on the balcony of Dr. Brosenham's house and see that the people came out of worship, the Catholic Mass early in the morning, and then the whole town would just explode. People had a wonderful time all through Sunday morning and afternoon, and Rachel said this was wrong, and she prevailed upon her husband to insisting to him that among the ordinances that were put in place when the United States and Florida became part of the United States at the territory, that there be an ordinance detailing how people should worship and how they should observe the Sabbath. And her husband complied. It was one of the ordinances presented that first day. However, I don't think we can honestly say that made a great difference in the way these people did worship immediately. Now, as the Americans took charge here, of course, there were a number of very active Protestant organizations that had developed during the colonial period, and all of them, several of them, had major conference organizations. So very shortly after the settling in here of Andrew Jackson, we see the arrival in Pensacola of Reverend Alexander Talley. Mr. Talley was sent out of the Carolina Conference of the Methodist Church, and his order was to try and establish Protestant missions in Pensacola and in Mobile. Reverend Talley labored faithfully here for a year, and he did not succeed, according to his diary at least, he did not succeed in signing up a single convert. He left and went on his way to become a chaplain to the Cherokees in North Carolina. Now, from that point on, the Methodist Church sent out a succession of men who would serve here for over the period of the next 10 years. There was Ashley Hewitt, Henry Cook, John Lambeth, Isaac Boring, Adam Myrick. All of them had very minimal success, except for Mr. Cook. And he succeeded in building a little chapel at the corner of Tarragona and Zaragoza Street. And that was basically what we had as a Protestant church for the next few years. It wasn't much, and we know that because one of the next people to come was a Presbyterian minister, and his name was David Robinson Preston. Mr. Preston came down here, and he made visits up and down the Escambia River where lumbering activities were just beginning, activities to support the building of the forts. And he reported back to his conference that, yes, there was the coming of some Presbyterians here, but they were so scattered, there was little opportunity for them to found a church. And so he didn't recommend that, but his diary tells us a wonderful story of what things were like here. And on one or two occasions, the Methodist missionary here gave Preston the right to use the little chapel, the Methodist chapel, and he did so. And his story talks about the fact that he preached there on a very cold night. There was no heating in the church. There was no adequate windows to keep out the chill. And he said, in addition to that, he preached to what he called a small crowd. Well, right after that came Reverend Williston. Now, Reverend Williston was took a different approach. Reverend Williston was sent forth by the Carolina Conference of the Episcopal Church. He arrived in town, looked around, and said, I'm going to take a different tack on this. So he went down to the new Pensacola Gazette newspaper, and he placed a little ad on the front page, which said basically this: I invite all who are practicing Protestant Christians to join me for a meeting in Government House at 7 o'clock on Thursday evening. Of course, he had no idea who might show up, but as it turned out, it was quite a crowd. There were 12 Episcopalians, 10 Methodists, 2 Baptists, and 2 Presbyterians, all gathered in there. They had a wonderful meeting that night, and as a sort of a religious miracle, these people agreed to do something together. They said, we want to found a functioning church, and we've got enough people here now to do that if we work together. And so they agreed that they would work to raise funds, to get property, and so create a Protestant church here. And they began that almost that very week. Now they got a gift of land that faced Seville Square, and they began to get dollars here and dollars there. And one of the things that helped them, it's sort of an interesting tale, one of the larger contributions that they got came because the U.S. Constitution, Old Ironsides, was making a visit to the Navy Yard at Pensacola. And by that time, Commodore Warrington had left, and Commodore Woolsey, who was an ardent Episcopalian, went on board the ship, and he may have done a little arm twisting in doing this, but nonetheless, the Commodore raised about $360, which was at that point a very large part of the funds being gathered. Now also forthcoming about the same time was a gift of $500, which came from Christ Church of Philadelphia. Well, all of this came together, construction began, and so that by the early part of April of the year 1832, we now have a Episcopal Church with all 4 of these denominations participating. And of course, because the Episcopalians were the most numerous, it was agreed that they would indeed follow that form of worship. Now, I wish I could tell you that this new arrangement went forward with no troubles at all. The denominations flowed in, everything grew, and there was some growth. But they faced the usual financial problems that you could take. And also there was another concern. The Episcopal Church sent forth men to be the pastors of this church, but they had a very difficult time because they died. There were several of them. In fact, Reverend Curran had produced this little book here, which talks about the story of what happened to three of those men who died. Two of them of fever, some of the third of natural causes, and all three of them ultimately were buried below the chancel in Christ Church. And for many years there was a question, did that really happen? And it was more than a century later that one good Episcopalian, a man named Crawford Rainwater, supplied the dollars, and Dr. Judy Benz from the university and her archaeological staff, literally with permission from the church, went underneath the chancel to do an archaeological study to see were the remains actually there, and the answer was yes, they are. And so they were very carefully reinterred there, and so we know today, yes, that story was true. Well, these four denominations remained together for a period of 13 years. And beginning in 1845, each one of them had grown sufficiently so that the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and the Methodists split away. Each one built its own church down in the Seville Square area. And so the Episcopalians were left as the sole occupants of Christ Church. And that's the way, of course, things continued. That particular church was the Episcopal Church and would remain so until the year 1903. Well, of course, right about this same time, as this church opened, there was a movement almost worldwide that had come out of England. It is called the Oxford Movement. And this was a rebirth of energy and enthusiasm within the Christian church almost worldwide. And because of that, of course, more and more people wanted to flood in, and all of the denominations here and elsewhere began to grow numerically. And we can see that between 1832, when Christ Church was built, up to the war between the states, the numbers of all of the denominations were growing. Now, for example, in the Presbyterian Church, the story was something like this. When they opened their new church on Intendencia Street in 1845, they called a man named Peter Donan. Reverend Donan apparently did a very good job for almost a decade. And then one of the interesting stories, again, about religion here, Reverend Donan did something that we really can't explain. The session minutes, as they were recorded then, said that Mr. Donan lost his reason and disappeared from the community with all of the church records. They didn't say that he took the money, just the church records, and we know very little about him beyond that. He never turns up in the story again. But about the same time, of course, a new pastor arrives here for the Presbyterians, and all of these churches continue on with a very fine story, even though the community is small, through the period leading up to the war between the states. And of course, by the time we get into the mid-1850s, the problems that were besetting North and South were beginning to affect the churches as well. The abolitionist movement in the North, of course, was driving a wedge between churches in the North and the South. And here in the South, most of the churches, this was certainly true in Pensacola, most of the churches here sided with the overall thought that slavery was to be maintained, and that if the states had to secede from the Union to make this possible, they were going to do this. And so that's exactly the way things stood when the war began in early 1861. And through the next 13 months, all of these churches went about their business, doing their thing. And then, of course, as they got closer and closer to the month of May in 1862, it was obvious that the Pensacola itself was going to be evacuated. And the question, what shall we do with our church? How can we preserve it? The Yankees may come in here and desecrate it. What will we do? Well, of course, the answer was we carefully caulked the windows, we locked the door, and everyone take care of any records that we may have here in hand. And at that point in time, all of the denominations, this included the Catholic Church as well as all of the Protestant denominations, they elected to depart, and the churches were locked and closed. And so through the remaining 3 years of the war, they remained empty. And that's the way they stood when Appomattox came and the war between the states ended. And of course, beginning in 1865, people began to move back, and that will be the next chapter of our story.